Well, when we look back at the texts of the ancient world, it's incredibly easy to get lost in the sweeping epics, the massive battles, the cowering historical figures. But if you really want to understand the daily lives, the theology, and the very foundation of ancient Israelite society, you have to look at what was on their plates. So let's dive into this explainer on the cycle of sustenance and see how their entire existence actually revolved around a profoundly complex relationship with food. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the ever-present threat of famine and early survival, move on to the miracle of manna in the wilderness, then unpack the strict rules around clean and unclean meats, and finally look at gleaning and ancient charity.
Okay, so this iconic verse right here in Genesis sets our baseline. It tells us that the struggle for sustenance wasn't just some secondary issue for these people. It was humanity's primary exhausting burden. To literally just eat bread, you had to sweat. It's a stark reminder that in the ancient world, survival was never, ever guaranteed.
Which brings us to our first major point, famine, and the constant existential threat it posed to early biblical figures. Just look at this incredible moment. We have Esau speaking to his brother Jacob, and he is just absolutely blinded by desperation. He's a skilled hunter, right? But he comes in from the field so faint, so completely famished, that he willingly trades his entire lifelong birthright for a single bowl of red lentil stew. It just goes to show that back then, immediate physical hunger easily eclipsed even the highest societal privileges. And we see this theme building across different eras. On one hand, you have Esau's impulsive, famished state, but contrast that with the quiet, grim reality of the widow of Zarephath. She literally tells the prophet Elijah she's gathering sticks to cook her absolute final handful of meal and oil so she and her son can eat it and then die. These texts repeatedly use intense hunger as a catalyst to remind us that human survival hung by a very thin thread. In fact, you can map the entire historical trajectory of the Israelites as one epic, multi-generational search for food security. Think about it. Famines in Canaan forced the early patriarchs to migrate. That leads them to rely on the food reserves of Egypt, where they end up enslaved. Then, they escape into the arid wilderness, where there's zero food, relying completely on miracles, until they finally arrive in a land famously defined by its agriculture, a land flowing with milk and honey. So, what happens in that arid desert? Let's talk about manna in the wilderness and how the text addresses this existential threat through divine provision. What's truly fascinating here is what the people actually missed when they were in the desert. They're weeping, complaining that their souls are dried away. But they aren't just missing generic calories. They are fondly remembering the flavors. The fish, the refreshing cucumbers and melons, the sharp bite of leeks, onions, and garlic. They were literally choosing the memory of that rich, diverse diet over the reality of their newfound freedom. So in response to their complaining, they get a radical divine intervention, manna. The text describes it as a small, round thing, kind of resembling coriander seed. They'd gather it up, grind it in mills, and bake it into cakes that tasted like wafers made with honey. But here's the catch. It was an unprecedented, daily rationed food source. You couldn't hoard it. If you tried to save it overnight, it bred worms and stank, except right before the Sabbath. And get this, they ate this mysterious substance for 40 years. 40 years! That's an incredibly long span of time. An entire generation grew up where their primary daily sustenance literally fell with the dew every single morning. It directly tied their physical survival to their daily obedience. Now, once they finally survived the wilderness, everything changed again. Let's look at the Levitical dietary code and the strict rules of clean and unclean meats. The book of Leviticus subjected them to what we can almost think of as a rigid, theological food and safety administration. Diet was actually used to visibly separate the Israelites from surrounding nations. They were to be a holy and peculiar people, so every single meal became a matter of strict law. They had to actively practice their theology every time they sat down to eat. Leviticus chapter 11 establishes this complex but unbending formula. For land animals, they had to part the hoof and chew the cud, like an ox or a sheep. Miss just one of those traits, like a camel or a pig, and it was unclean. Water creatures needed both fins and scales, and anything that, quote, goeth upon the belly was an absolute abomination. This created an incredibly specific and restricted cultural diet. But beyond just categorizing the animals, there was an absolute universal prohibition against consuming blood. For the life of the flesh is in the blood. This reveals a profound ancient respect for the sacred essence of life. Even if an animal was clean, the blood had to be poured out on the earth like water. You could eat the flesh, for sure, but you were never ever to consume the life force. Now, let's shift from the strict rules of the table to the incredibly compassionate rules of the field. Let's explore gleaning, an ancient charity. Leviticus and Deuteronomy commanded this fascinating built-in societal safety net. When a landowner harvested their crops, they were legally forbidden from taking everything. They couldn't reap the corners of their fields, they couldn't go back for dropped grapes or fallen wheat. They were forced to purposefully leave a portion of their literal wealth right there on the ground. Why? So the poor and the stranger could come and glean, maintaining their dignity by actually working for their food. And we get to see this beautiful law in action in the book of Ruth. Ruth is an impoverished widow and a foreigner, gleaning in the fields of a wealthy landowner named Boaz. But Boaz goes way above and beyond the strict legal requirement. He secretly orders his workers to let fall some of the handfuls of purpose for her, literally dropping extra prime barley right in her path. It's just an incredible picture of ancient charity. This concept of agricultural charity gets pushed to its absolute limit with the seventh-year Sabbath. Every 7 years, the land itself had to rest. No sowing, no pruning. And whatever grew naturally that year belonged to everyone equally, the servants, the strangers, even the cattle. Think about the immense faith that required. To intentionally stop producing food for a whole year and just trust that your old store of food would sustain the entire nation. When the land was yielding its strength, it was incredibly rich. Check out this vital supply drop brought to King David when he was fleeing into the wilderness. Wheat, barley, parched corn, beans, lentils, honey, butter, sheep, and cheese. It gives us a perfect, vivid snapshot of just how diverse and robust the ancient Levantine diet could be. We've covered some incredible ground today. We've seen how food in these ancient texts wasn't just physical fuel. It was a matter of divine law. It was an instrument for communal survival. And it was a profound mechanism for charity. Which leaves us with a final thought to consider. If an ancient society encoded their absolute deepest moral values into how they managed and shared their harvest, what do our modern, industrialized food systems reflect about us today?